Today's learning module is about ensuring you have an appropriate tone, which is an important feature of the task achievement category of Task 1 in the IELTS General Training Writing Test. We have 3 learning objectives in this module. Our first learning goal is that by the end of this unit, you will be able to explain the difference between an appropriate and an inappropriate tone, which is something many test takers are not clear on. Second, you will be able to identify the main differences between what makes up a Band 5, Band 6, or Band 7 in the task achievement category from the IELTS public version band descriptors. Finally, by the end of this unit, you'll be able to match phrases for General Training Task 1 with their purpose. If you can correctly match an appropriate phrase with the letter's purpose, you've taken an important step toward getting an appropriate tone in writing Task 1 of the IELTS General Training Test. So let's begin. A lot of people feel that the IELTS General Training Writing is much easier than the IELTS Academic Writing Test because Task 1 of the General Training Test is writing a letter. And if you've studied English in many countries around the world, one of the writing activities you've probably done for years in your English classes is to compose a letter. So some people who are preparing to sit for the IELTS General Training Test don't bother to prepare for Task 1 because they think, hey, I've written hundreds of letters in English classes over the years. I know how to do it well. One of the people who thought that was Dr. George, who I once coached in preparing for his third attempt in the IELTS General Training Test. This, by the way, is not his real picture, and it's not his real name. Dr. George was so frustrated because he has a master's degree in English language and literature from his native country, Pakistan, and so he is a fluent writer with a large vocabulary who rarely makes grammar errors. But he seemed to struggle with the letter writing task in the IELTS General Training Test. So Dr. George told me that he and his wife were quarreling a lot because while waiting for each attempt at the IELTS test, he was at home instead of being able to work. And while Dr. George was at home, he found his way into the kitchen, which was frustrating to his wife. His wife liked to cook her way, but Dr. George, who was around the home, was always giving her advice on how to do things. Dr. George's wife preferred him to be out of the house and working to allow her to cook in peace, so she said to him, "Please get help with your IELTS test so you don't bother me here." And that's how Dr. George came to me for help. What Dr. George did not know was that there are elements of the scoring for writing that are not directly related to grammar or spelling or vocabulary. They're related to knowledge and understanding of the particular task. This is the case in both Task 1 and Task 2 of the IELTS General Writing Test, but especially so in Task 1. As we'll see in our next slide, there are 4 parts to how the examiner rates your writing, and each of those account for 25% of your score. The organization you use in your writing, the accuracy of your grammar, and the way you use vocabulary each make up 25%, but the final 25% is how well you've completed the task. As Dr. George found out, excellent grammar, perfect spelling, and great organization were not enough. Dr. George missed some things in the task that are very important in getting a high score: an appropriate tone and complete coverage of all 3 bullet points. Here you can see the public version of the band descriptors. The writing examiner has more detail than this, which they refer to when marking your Task 1, but the public version is very helpful for us as test takers. You can view the public version of the band descriptors on the official IELTS website, IELTS.org. So I highly recommend that you familiarize yourself with the public band descriptors so you know clearly how your general training task 1 writing will be scored. Where you see the letters GT on the public band descriptors, that stands for the general training IELTS test. A stands for the academic version of IELTS. In this unit, we are of course focusing on those items of the public band descriptors that refer specifically to GT, general training. If an item on the band descriptors has neither a GT nor an A in front of it, that means the item is relevant to both the general training and the academic tests. You'll also note that there are 4 categories of scoring and that each of them account for 25% of your total Task 1 writing band score. To be awarded a particular band level, your writing must meet all the positive criteria for that level. In the example here, this test taker used organization in their writing that scored band 7. They used vocabulary that was awarded band 7 and used grammar characteristic of band 7. However, with task achievement, the category on the left, they did not meet all the positive criteria for band 7 nor even of band 6 and so scored a band 5. Since each of these 4 categories are worth 25%, their total score fell to the average, 6.5, despite having band 7 grammar, band 7 vocabulary, and band 7 organization. So in the next slide, we'll look more closely at task achievement, the category on the left. You will see that this test taker scored 6.5 not because of his or her written language, which was awarded a 7, but because of matters related to the nature of the task. You can see that I've highlighted in yellow some parts of the task achievement category. In our next slide, we'll take a closer look at those highlighted parts. This is a close-up of the criteria for Band 5, 6, Band 7, and Band 8 of the task achievement category that we saw on the previous slide. Remember, you must meet all of the positive criteria in a particular band in order to be awarded that band score. I've circled the letters GT to indicate those criteria that apply specifically to the general training IELTS test. In Band 7, the tone is appropriate and consistent. In contrast, the tone in Band 6 is inconsistent, meaning it doesn't stay the same. In Band 5, the tone is variable, meaning it varies or it changes, and it is sometimes inappropriate. Notice that in Band 7, the tone is appropriate, but in Band 5, it's inappropriate. If you meet all the other criteria for Band 7, like grammar and vocabulary and organized writing, but you lack a consistent and appropriate tone, you may receive a Band 5. So, if you want an overall Band 7 in the IELTS General Training Writing task, you'll need to provide a consistent and appropriate tone. So, what is meant by a consistent tone? Here we have a publicly available example of Task 1 of the IELTS General Training Test, adapted from takeielts.britishcouncil.org. In this example, you are asked to write a letter to a friend, giving them instructions on how to take care of your pet while you're away on holiday. This kind of letter requires a certain tone. For example, you notice that there is a blank, a series of dots after the word dear, and that means you can address the person who's receiving your letter by name. So you could say, Dear Hamid or Dear May. Another example of tone is that you might begin your letter by asking, How are you? Before moving to the main part of the letter, the specific request for help, you might ask about their family and their daughter who's away studying at university or something similar. These are the kinds of things that we mean when we say tone. The second example is from IELTS.com, and the letter you need to write here is much more formal. And so the tone you write in will need to be more formal. You'll notice that it begins with "Dear Sir" or "Madam," which is a way we sometimes begin a formal letter in English when we don't know the name or title of the person we're sending the letter to. In this kind of letter, it would not be appropriate to ask, "How are you?" It would be appropriate to introduce yourself by saying your name, by explaining that you're a student at the college, perhaps giving your room number at the accommodation, and so on. It would not be really appropriate to talk about your feelings. For example, you wouldn't say that you don't like the student that you share the room with, or you hate the student you share the room with, but you might describe the behaviors she or he does that make it difficult for you to study. So the very first thing you should do in IELTS General Training Task 1, as soon as you've read the question, is try to work out the tone that's required. Is it a formal situation, therefore requiring a more formal tone? Or is it an informal situation where you can be more relaxed and personal in the way you communicate? In our next slide, we'll look at some of the words and phrases for letters that are appropriate in a formal tone. Here are some examples of words and phrases you can use for beginnings, requests, apologies, and complaints that will convey a formal tone. So let's do a short writing exercise at this point. In the previous slide, you saw a writing task where you were asked to write to the accommodation officer at your college to explain a troubling situation with your roommate. I'd like you to pause the video here and write 3 sentences to the accommodation officer about this roommate situation, using a phrase from the beginning box, a phrase from the complaint box, a phrase from the request box. When you've completed 3 sentences, restart the video. Here, we see some words and phrases you can use to close off your formal letter, specifically endings and sign-offs. Many IELTS candidates make the mistake of ending their letter very abruptly and going straight to the sign-off before these transitional phrases and sentences, which are a very important aspect of tone in English writing. The endings listed here give a final opportunity for further discussion before bringing the letter to a close. Now, with sign-offs, some people make the point that yours sincerely should end a letter that you've begun with a name, and that yours faithfully should accompany a letter that is begun with "Dear Sir" or "Madam." I personally have never followed that rule, and from a reader's perspective, don't make a distinction in use between the two. One thing I will say for IELTS General Training Task 1, though, don't forget the comma after your closings. The block writing style that's now common in business writing omits punctuation in salutations and sign-offs, but you don't want the examiner who's marking your writing to think it's a punctuation error. So I recommend a comma following these sign-offs to be sure. I also recommend that you look at ESLBuzz.com, the URL provided at the bottom of this page and the next slide, which gives a lot of very useful words and phrases for formal letter writing. Here are some phrases for an informal tone. If Task 1 of the IELTS General Training Test asks you to write to a friend or a family member. Again, I encourage you to pause the video here and write several sentences using these phrases. Choose a phrase from the beginnings box, a phrase from the purposes box, and a phrase from one that accepts an invitation and one that declines an invitation. When you've finished writing those and checked your grammar and spelling, restart the video and we'll bring up some endings and some sign-offs for informal letters.